All right, thank you, Pete. Thank you all of you for being here today. And I wanted to say we did try to fix these slides. You can see that the title's cut off a little bit. You'll see that there's a few pictures that are over some words, and we have no idea why it's doing this. But as with all good technology, we're just going to shrug our shoulders and trudge on. So today I want to cover a little bit about how to plant native seeds, but also why and how to use herbicides to really help prepare that seed bed and then maintain that native seeding afterwards. So first of all, like why in the world would we be worried about planting native seed? This is because of a few reasons. One, the increase in oil and gas activity across Texas has definitely been a big producer in pushing for more native seed availability from commercial retailers. Just in South Texas alone, the Eagle Ford Shale is estimated to involve over 12 million acres. And so you can imagine on a landscape scale, this is creating a lot of fragmentation, a lot of opportunities for invasive species to come in, and kind of changing our landscape from what used to be pristine natives into more of an introduced species mix when people come back and replant those pipelines with introduced species. So having that native seed available is going to be really important, not only now, but in the future. Also, changing land ownership. So a lot of times people come and buy property that maybe used to be a traditional cow-calf ranch. They maybe had introduced species they were using for forage, and they're interested in switching that land back over to a native landscape. And so trying to figure out ways to help them have successful native reseedings is really important. Also, with all the equipment and high vehicle flow, it's really taken a lot of these areas where that had pristine natives and bringing in noxious plant seeds. And any type of noxious plant is one that takes over an area quite quickly. And so it can become more of a monoculture where you have maybe a dominant plant species as opposed to a diversity of native plants that we're typically looking for wildlife lands. Also, not only just the pipelines from this oil and gas activity, but this fragmentation is coming in the way of pad sites, roads, and all kinds of urban development. So why would you choose to plant natives? If introduced species were growing there already, why wouldn't you just maintain that land with introduced species? There's a number of reasons that someone may choose to plant natives, but the few reasons that I could think of included increasing the plant diversity. So it's been shown that where you have more plant diversity, you could carry more insect and animal diversity. And so these plants are being used not only as a food source, but also as cover for many wildlife species. And plus natives can also be grazed. So they're beneficial for both wildlife and livestock species. Also, natives are adapted to our climate. So if any of you have introduced fields, you're aware that the price of fertilizer is not going down. And so as we look long term in what we want our land to look like and how we want to put inputs into our property, if you're not interested in maintaining that fertilizing regime, then natives might be a good way to go because they're adapted for the climate. They don't need to be fertilized, and they're really quite hardy for if they're adapted to that ecoregion. Also, natives are usually planted in a mix, and so we'll talk about how to select those seeds. But if you plant natives in a mix, then you're not going to have one grass or one plant that's necessarily dominating all year long. And so this diversity allows it to be more of a plant community, which we talked about how plant diversity is really important. And then, of course, aesthetics and natural beauty. People like to look out and see a natural landscape. One thing I'd like to think about is what are we going to want our land to look like in the future, and what uses will be conducted on our land in the future. So will your kids or your grandkids, will they want to run livestock? Are they going to be interested in wildlife or wildlife and livestock where natives might be more appropriate? So kind of thinking about what we want our land to look like is a really important reason that many people choose to plant native plants. So reasons that you might plant, you know, people often tell me, well, I have this situation, should I plant or should I wait? And a lot of times people plant if the native seed bank is absent. So What case might this be? I would think of maybe a place that was cropped. So there were crops in an area and they decided to turn that back into rangeland or a pasture, and so native reseeding might be the thing to do because their topsoil likely doesn't have that free native seed already there. Also, if something was done to the land and they have very slow vegetation recovery and they're worried about soil erosion, they might go ahead and plant those plants and hope to establish that soil there before it's blown away. Also, it could limit weedy or invasive plant species because leaving that bare ground open allows sunlight to penetrate into the soil. And if there's seeds there that are weed seeds or undesirable invasive species, they're going to get that sunlight and germinate and come up. And so you're going to find yourself in those bare ground areas having weedy or invasive species, and you may not want that. So establishing native plants early on, the desirable plants that you'd like to see, you can actually reduce the impact of these weedy species. Also, just improving your plant diversity. So maybe you look at your property and you think, man, I really don't have that many different plants, and I don't have that many that are valuable for the wildlife species or the livestock species that I'm interested in having. So you might want to reevaluate what is needed and plant just those species in, because sometimes when we think about planting, we think about like a garden, totally removing everything in an area, but you could go in and just interseed native plants. So you actually would plant over what you already have there. So a lot of different reasons that you might plant and a lot of opportunities to utilize native seeds. This picture down there that's so graciously covering up the words is actually a picture of South and Central Texas at night. And so you can see where that Eagle Ford shell is really having an impact on the environment by the lights at night, and it's really fragmenting our landscape, bringing in a lot of different invasive species and traffic, of course. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and talk about how to select the native seed mix. So that's where a lot of people get stumped is, how do I find what seeds would work well on my property? And native reseeding used to have a pretty bad rap, and that's because native seeds were more difficult to come by, and they weren't necessarily adapted for that area that the people were planting. So if I were to get some seeds that do really well in West Texas and plant them in Corpus Christi, they may or may not do so well because the environment is different. And especially if I took plants that are used to a high rainfall belt like Corpus Christi, and I took them to a dry area like West Texas, those seeds will likely not germinate. So knowing where your seeds originated from is really important when selecting your native seed. And in the past, we just didn't have that many available, and so native reseeding kind of got a bad rap. But there's been a lot of developments, especially through the South Texas Natives Program. That's a program run through Cesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M Kingsville, and they've done a phenomenal job of developing with plant material centers these new seeds that are made for certain ecoregions. And so those have been released to commercial wholesalers, and so they're growing these seeds and selling them in plant mixes. And so it's a really positive program they have going on there. And if you're not in South Texas and you're thinking, well, that's not really pertaining to me, I have good news, because South Texas Natives has a new Texas Native Seed Division that's looking at more of the northern central Texas area, and they'll also be working in West Texas. So they're really doing a lot to try to bring a lot of new commercially released seed varieties that will grow well for your area across the entire state. So if you want to select what native seeds you would need for a plot, first you would need to determine your soil type. So there's two ways you can do this. One way is just to take a soil sample, which they have the instructions on the Forage Lab with Texas A&M's website, or you could send it to any soil sampling lab. You would send that off and they could tell you what your soil type was, and that would help you narrow that down. Also, I really love the Web Soil Survey. It's a program through the USDA NRCS. We're going to look at how to utilize Web Soil Survey for these purposes, but they also have a new phone app that was put out by UC Davis called Soil Web, and that uses the GPS in your phone to tell you what type of soils you're standing on. So of course it's kind of rough because Web Soil Survey, although it's better than when we had the paper soil maps, there's still maybe they only poke a hole every 3,000 miles or so. So it's a little bit rough, but they're able to use LiDAR imaging and topography to help smooth out these areas. So it's really a pretty powerful resource for understanding the soils and the plants that should be on your property. Okay, so you know your soil type. Now determine what plants will grow on that soil type. So there's really three main areas we go for that. Again, the Web Soil Survey, which we'll look at. Also, nearby remnant native habitat is a great way to start. So if you've got some area next door that actually is nice native habitat that you're hoping to make your area look like and there's similar soils, then you could go over there and see what plants are doing well and thriving and see if those are available commercially to plant. So that would be an excellent place to start. And also South Texas Natives has a great website that again will hopefully be spread into other regions soon that will tell you plants that are good for your area. So here's a South Texas Native site seeding recommendations tab that's circled there in yellow. When you click on that, it's going to take you to a region of Texas that they're considering South Texas. And again, they're working on Texas native seeds, which is in Central Texas and also in West Texas. But for now, this is available for South Texas, and you'll just click on your area. And then it's going to take you to a choice of 4 main types of soil: coarse soils, fine soils, shallow, or stay lean. And if you're not really sure where your soils fit into there, you can read the little descriptions below, which are pretty good to help you classify your soils. So you click on your main soil type, and it's going to tell you based on your area and your main soil type, these are the seeds and the varieties that are available to plant that will do well in your region. So they came up with these recommendations based off a lot of research, on the ground research that's been done and collected over the years. So really cool information. Not only do they give you what seeds to plant, but they tell you what % of your mix you might consider making that, and the seed dealer where you can find those seeds at. So you won't even have to run around trying to figure out who has the seed. Also, the variety you'll see over on the left-hand side is extremely important, because if somebody says you need to plant, say, switchgrass or hooded windmill grass, that's fine and good, but you have to know what variety would grow well in your area, because there's several varieties that were adapted for different regions of Texas. So always make sure you check what the variety is and where that variety originated. And then the NRCS Web Soil Survey, which was the other application that we talked about using to not only define what soils you have, but also what plants may grow there. You can find this website just simply by Googling Web Soil Survey. That's what I typically do. But if you'd rather write down the address, it's websoilsurvey.nrcs.usda.gov. So when it comes up, it's going to be the entire United States, because of course Web Soil Survey through USDA was developed for the entire 50 states. And if you look over on the left-hand side, you'll be on this Area of Interest tab right here, the first tab. And down here, you're going to define your address. You could put in state and county or however you want to find your place. If you actually know a physical address, you could use the physical address for that. So you'll put that information in, and it's going to zoom the map in to this area. So you'll be seeing an entire view of whatever you put in. Next, you're going to use these zoom in, zoom out tools right here at the top left to zoom into the area you're most interested in. And then you'll use these AOI or area of interest buttons to either make a rectangular square around what you want to select, or you can do kind of a free form one, which is what I've done here. You just simply click, 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 and then you double click at the end, and then it'll put these blue lines through it. And so when you see the blue lines, you know that you've defined your area of interest. So simply your ranch or your pastures or whatever you're interested in looking up the soil type on. Next, you'll go to the soil map, which is the second tab. Soil map will tell you what soils are in that area of interest, how many acres that comprises, and the % of your area of interest. So a lot of information right there. If you click on one of these soil types, it's going to give you, let me see if I did it. No. If you click on the soil type, it'll give you more information than you probably ever wanted to know about Rio Concho clay loam or Tobosa clay. It'll tell you what the different profiles are as you move down through the soil profile. A lot of information right there. If you go over here to this yellow circled area, you can actually print or save this file to your computer at this point, or simply add it to your shopping cart, which is misleading because it's free, but they'll just add that map later. So you could, if you chose to, go ahead and download the map and stop right here with those few clicks. This is what your report would look like. And then it would have a little legend and then your different soils that are in your area of interest. But if you'll be brave and go with me to the third tab, the Soil Data Explorer, this is where it's pretty mind-blowing because it has more information in here than you probably really want to know. But like if you go to vegetative productivity, it could tell you what poundage of forage your soils should be carrying. So it's a good way to see if your soils are as productive as they could be based on what plant communities are there. But right now, if we'll go over here to this fourth tab, Ecological Site Assessment, we're going to look at where you can find the different plants that should grow on that soil. So here at the Ecological Site Assessment tab, it looks like we've got a few different options for this area for ecological sites. And this is just saying, you know, based on the climate and the location and the soil type, topography and everything, what type of ecological site lays there. And then when you click on it, it's going to give you more information about each type of site. So in this example, here's 4 different pictures of the same site. So what it could look like as succession moves on or as the different plants move into a community. So typically we start out with like annual weeds, and then it goes up to perennials, and then it'll eventually be brush. So you can kind of figure out where you are on this continuum for your land. Oh, I missed this. So, and then also when you click on one of these ecological sites, down here it's going to actually list what plant species as far as forbs and grasses and brush you should find on this type of site. So pretty good way to get some initial information and think, okay, if these grasses grow well on this site, then that's the ones I'm going to see if I can get seeds for that are adapted for my area. Okay. Here's the Soil Web smartphone app that I was talking about, and again, it's through the UC Davis, but Soil Web you could download on your smartphone, or it could actually be used as an overlay on Google Earth if you like Google Earth. Soil Web's pretty cool. It has the same information as Web Soil Survey. It's just kind of an easier to use app that you could carry with you in the field and use your phone's GPS to find that information. Okay, so if later on you were like, okay, Web Soil Survey, what did that girl say to do? You could just go to the Web Soil Survey webpage, and normally you would click on this green button, Start Web Soil Survey, but you could look at these 4 basic steps, and it'll define exactly how to make at least a simple map. And then remember to go over to that third tab so that you can look at more information about each soil. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about native seeds. The first thing I want to cover is purchasing native seeds. So when you go, you decide, okay, I'm going to get this list of maybe 12 different grasses and forbs. Well, you're going to go to the commercial dealer, and they're going to sell seed based on PLS, or percent live seed. If they try to sell you seed based on bulk, then I really wouldn't buy from them, because PLS, percent live seed, is telling you what percent of that seed that's actually in that bag is viable and is going to germinate. So it's normal that not all the seeds are viable and going to germinate, but they need to disclose that because you're going to plant based on a PLS, or percent live seed basis. So make sure that you're buying on that basis as well. Also on the seed tag, you're going to see dormancy. And I've gotten some questions about that because people think, well, it's got some dormancy in it, and so I don't think that's good because it's saying it's not going to germinate right away. But, you know, in our weather in Texas can really vary. And so having some seeds that are really have a little bit of dormancy and may come up later on can be a really positive thing for keeping that site successful. So don't be scared if you've got a little bit of dormancy in your seed. So also, as we were speaking about earlier, be aware that there's different varieties. So you can't just go buy any switchgrass. You need to make sure you know what variety grows best in your area and look for that specific variety, because it will not be successful if you purchase a variety that's not made for your ecoregion. So every seed bag that you purchase will come with a Texas Department of Ag tag, and this is telling you where that it's been tested and the origin. So sometimes people get confused because they think, well, the origin is where dependent on where I purchased the seed, and likely they've gotten seeds nearby, but the origin is where that seed originally came from, and it was grown and tested later on somewhere else, and then eventually is grown at the commercial dealer and sold. So the origin isn't necessarily where that seed dealer's place is located and they now grow it. So make sure you look at the seed tags and know where the origin is. Also, we would encourage you to order well in advance of when you think you're going to be planting, because although native seeds have become more available, there's also a limit on them. So only so much of those commercial dealers' land is put towards growing native seeds. So you want to make sure that you get your name on the list well in advance if you know that you're going to be planting within the next year or so. So when you buy a mix, we encourage you to plant a mix because it'll help your site be more successful. So it's a little more resilient. When you purchase plants, you're going to not only pick a mix of grasses and forbs, but you'll also want to get early cereal stages and later cereal stages. So sometimes we say an early successional stage, a mid-successional stage, and a late successional stage. And all that's doing is making sure that you have some plants that are going to come up right away, which I think I said earlier is typically your annual weeds, and then those perennials are going to come up later. So if I asked all of you to type in what plants you would want to see in your native seed mix, I'm guessing I would get a lot of tall, pretty grasses. And that's what I'm typically told is, hey, I'd like for this site to be a pretty tall grass area. Well, those grasses can grow there, but a lot of times they come up much later than those early forb species. And so when you plant, it's good to recognize that you're going to see those early cereal stages before the mid and late successional species. So it's just somewhat of preparing yourself, and planting the seed mix is hedging your bets and getting something established on that land, and then later those grasses that you're really desiring will come up. So if you're going to plant a mix, the seed dealer can actually mix that up for you. And like in that picture, they're technically going to mix all of your fluffy seeds and all of your hard seeds together. So that's why it's important, if you do use a native seed drill, that you use one that is made for natives, because it'll have different boxes for both the chaffy and the hard seeds. So make sure that they actually mix them separated too. This blue you see there, let me see, in this hard seed mix, is not actually a blue seed. It's just a seed that's been covered in talc that would be fluffy, but now it can be planted in the native hard seed mix. So there are those options as well. So after you buy your seed and you get it home, you're going to feel like you made a huge investment, because you really did. You'll want to store those seeds in a cool, dry, pest-free place. Of course, you don't want mice eating up all of your seeds you just bought. You may want to retest the quality if you store it for over a year, and we would encourage you to take that back to the place where you purchased it so that they can actually retest that at the same lab. That way you're getting, you can compare apples to apples, because they're going to use a certain lab to test all of their seed. Also, use a cooler if you're storing for longer periods of time, because that'll keep the seed more viable than if you just keep it in a shed. So we're going to talk about when the best time is to plant, but if you're going to plant in an off time, you might consider including a cover crop like brown top millet, wheat, or oats. That way it'll help hold that soil in place and keep other species from growing there until your species that you planted can come up. So a lot of times South Texas Natives recommends planting about 25% of what you would typically plant for a cover crop, and also still planting your entire 100% of your native seed mix. So still plant all the natives you're planning on planting according to their PLS, and go ahead and throw in that 25% of a cover crop recommendation. So now is seedbed preparation. So we're ready to plant. We go out to our place and we want to start getting that ground ready. A lot of times people picture like a garden, like you're going to have nice fluffy soil, but if you picture, say, a corn seed as compared to a native grass seed, you can think right off that a corn seed is a lot bigger. So a native seed really just needs to have good soil contact, seed to soil contact. And so we're going to prepare a nice flat, even surface. Make sure you don't have a whole lot of big clods. A lot of times people use an offset disc followed by a field cultivator just to get that area disked up and then flattened out a little bit more. You want the surface to be firm, but not too firm. You don't want it hard and compacted, so you're not going to run over it with heavy equipment, but you might just let it sit for a few days, or they say it's best if you get some rain and so that soil is able to compact naturally on its own. If you walk across your seed bed barefooted, you'll want to walk on it and not get soil between your toes. So that's a good rule of thumb, that you want it firm but not too firm. So you might need to rip or deep plow if you have highly compacted soils, but in most cases you're good just using some sort of disc and cultivator. So how far in advance of planting should you start preparing the site? Pete's going to put up a little questionnaire thing. There it is. Okay, so choose how far in advance you think you should start preparing.
If y'all have any questions, y'all feel free to type them in the chat pod, and Dr. Clayton will answer them.
Yeah.
Everybody
Okay.
answering is
So it looks like no one chose the answer that it actually is, but most of you said either 1 to 2 months or 6 to 12 months, and that's probably typical of what most people do. Um, let's see if I can move that. So typically you'll want to start thinking and preparing about 2 to 3 years in advance, and we're going to talk about why that's best. Native reseeding is not a cheap venture, and it takes a lot of technical skill. So starting way in advance will prepare your site a lot better and make sure that you're set up for success. Not that it can't be done in a shorter period of time, but you'll see that it's going to depend on the situation when we start talking about what needs to be done to actually prepare that site. All right, so the first thing is to make sure it's a good site to reseed. And so that might seem silly, but just want to point out that if you've got a rocky or a really steep site or very sandy or it's erosion prone, it may not be that you can't reseed it, but you need to recognize that there's going to be challenges and it may not be quite as successful, or it might take more effort or funding. So make sure it's a decent site, and you may even want to strategize what areas you replant first based on its ability to be successful. So identify your goals for the site. So what are you hoping to see? Is it a diversity of plants? Is it only grasses? What are you hoping to take out, and what are you hoping to replace that with? Know your noxious plants beforehand. So a lot of times people are replanting because they don't like what's there. And so if you've got old world blue stems or buffalo grass or something that you no longer want, then you're going to need to know what they are and how to reduce the competition later on by taking care of those plants ahead of time. My encouragement would be to take care of unwanted brush first. So anytime you leaf spray or stem spray brush plants, you're going to have to wait at least 1 full year before you can remove those brush species from the reseeding plot. So make sure you treat those first. And then if you use a mechanical means to remove brush, getting below, if it's a resprouting plant, getting below, say, 18 inches under the ground, then you'll want to make sure that you keep the ground fairly level or go back and level it after you remove that brush. So let's look at some herbicide options for grasses and forbs. The most common one that people use to remove all the vegetation is a broad spectrum herbicide. Typically we use glyphosate or Roundup. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, so there's many different versions of Roundup available. That's going to take out everything that's growing. So it's not selective. It's going to take out all of your grasses and all of your forbs. So be prepared for that shock. If you were hoping to keep something that's on your property, then a broadcast application of glyphosate is probably not for you. If you have soils that are fairly flat, then you'll probably want to go ahead and cultivate that, like maybe do some disking and try to mix up that topsoil and get some of those plants out of the ground, especially after you herbicide or apply herbicide. Allow those plants to die and then go ahead and work those into the soil so that they're not sticking up when you plant. You might have to do repeated treatments, especially if you've got those exotic grasses. They are really tough, and especially if they've been established there for some time, they might be big enough clumps that you're going to have to repeatedly disc and apply glyphosate in order to reduce them. I'd like to encourage you to not forget nearby areas. So if you're going to plant this beautiful new native planting and you've got nearby areas that have a lot of old world bluestem, you might want to make kind of a buffer area. So go ahead and treat outside of the area that you're planning to plant so that you have some sort of buffer around your area so it doesn't just automatically encroach when that area is bare ground before all those seeds have a chance to germinate. Also remember, you don't want to put down a pre-emergent herbicide. So that's one that is soil active. It's going to take care of sterilize the seeds in the soil because it's also going to sterilize the seeds when you plant them. So with like glyphosate, that's a post-emergent herbicide. So it's taking care of anything that's growing right then. So you could even do a glyphosate treatment the day before you actually plant your seeds because it's not a soil active herbicide. Malcolm asks, will Roundup be effective if applied in the winter months? If it's still green, so I'm not sure where you're located, but if there's green growing material, glyphosate could still be active. Definitely. So down here, we're still very green, so glyphosate would work. All right, let's look at some herbicide options for brush. With brush, we typically do leaf sprays that are specific to that certain species, so you need to know what species you're dealing with. But you also have the option of doing stem sprays or cut stump options where you're actually removing that tree and just treating the stump that's left. So we have a brush buster series that will be available on our AgriLife bookstore website that cover a lot of the main brush species and also how to do the cut stump method. Or you could look in our archived webinars. I think it was maybe 2 months ago or so that Dr. Morgan Russell did a webinar on brush busters itself. So if you'd like more information about how to treat brush, I'm not going to go into it today, but I would encourage you to go ahead and look on our archived website and go ahead and watch her webinar. It's really good. Lucas asks, will Roundup be effective on Cherokee rose? I don't know about that, Lucas. I would have to look at the label and see. Sorry, I don't know right off. All right, for planting. When you're planting, you're going to plant before you're expecting moisture. So for South Texas, we have a couple of options. That's to plant in early to mid-spring or late summer to early fall. Really, for this area and probably further west, late summer to early fall would probably be best because we get more consistent rainfall. So maybe we don't get more, but more likely to get rainfall during those times, and that would be really important for getting the plants to germinate before winter sets in. Also, there's 3 main types of planting methods. So the first one is going to be a native seed drill. So often the native seed drill is best because it comes with different boxes. If you use a traditional drill that's used for cropping, it's probably not going to have different box options. And the reason that it's important to have different boxes is because the chaffy or the fluffy and the hard seeds are going to come out at different rates. And so you really need to be able to calibrate them to be putting out the right amount so that you're not wasting your money or not planting enough. And that's hard to do if they're mixed. So having an actual native seed drill is important. A lot of times people will rent a native seed drill, so that might be an option for you. Native seed drill is probably the preferred method, but you could also broadcast the seed. So when you broadcast, it's a little bit harder to calibrate that seed that's put out on the land, but it can still work very effectively. Also, it's best, they say, to follow with packing. So you'll want to go back over that seed just to make sure you get that seed to soil contact that's so important in order for that seed to germinate. So make sure if you're going to broadcast to look into your options for packing it afterwards. Third is a hydro seeder. So the hydro seeder is a very expensive way to plant because it's actually mixing the seed with a mulch. It's like a slurry that's put out. And so you'll need quite a bit of water and this mulch to mix with the seed. But the hydro seeding is very effective for areas that are erodible. So if you've got a lot of slope or a really sensitive area, hydroseeding might be the way to go for that place. If you've ever driven down the road and you see a really steep slope and TxDOT has, it looks blue, that's probably been done with a hydroseeder. So it's just that slurry that's been put out with the seed to kind of hold it in place. And it's very, very effective. It's just more expensive than using a native seed drill or broadcast seeding, of course. Lucas asked how much rain you need for the plant to germinate. That's going to really vary on the plant species and the soil because some soil will hold moisture better than other soils, but typically you just need some moisture, just any moisture. So if you plant when it's already moist, that's all the better because it's getting good seed to soil contact and the moisture's already there. So yeah, good question. So here's another little quiz. If a native planting does not look successful within a year, pre-order seeds to replant at the next ideal time to avoid soil erosion. There it is. All right, this makes me very excited. So most of you said false, and that is the correct answer. I almost said that's true. That's confusing. False is the correct answer because native seedings often look very weedy or like a failure. So a good example I have is our research and demonstration ranch is La Capita. It's in Benbolt, which is near Alice. And Dr. Henselka, who was in my position previously, had a really beautiful bufflegrass field that I decided I was going to try to turn into a native field. And South Texas Natives did the planting for us, and it was this really beautiful dirt field for quite a long time because the drought set in. So I was a little bit nervous about that, and it stayed like a dirt field for quite a while. And then finally, when we got the rains, all the plants did come back. So don't call things out necessarily before a year. And if it's a droughty year, you might have to give it 3 years before it starts to look anything like you expected. So again, you're going to get those early cereal stages, but don't worry because those other seeds are sitting there in the soil ready to come up when the conditions are right. So patience is kind of the name of the game. If you're going to graze that area, you really need to plan into your grazing regime 1 to 3 years. Again, 3 years would be like if you had a drought for that area to not be grazed. And typically, you're going to want to wait at least 2 years to prescribe burn it. And that's because you want to leave those plants there to grow those roots enough so that when you say burn or when it's grazed, that plant can respond and come back instead of die. So leaving for that period of time is very, very important. So you're going to want to make that into your management plan, that deferment of the area for that time. The plants certainly can be grazed. In fact, a lot of times, low to moderate grazing is beneficial for an area. But if you graze too early, you're not only potentially hurting the root system and the whole plant, but you're also not getting that free seed. So I'd encourage you to let that plant go ahead and seed out. And so it's like the seeds that you planted are giving you more seeds, and then those seeds will return to the soil and germinate on their own. So leaving that plant there in order to seed and add back to the land is super beneficial. Also, during this time, you're going to want to maintain the area free of brush and invasive plants. So Lucas asked, if you defer the grazing, will it affect your ag exemption? And so typically you're not going to reseed your entire property. And so you'll still have livestock on part of your property. And so I wouldn't imagine that being much of a problem. But if you're concerned about that, I would check with your appraisal office beforehand just to make sure. But typically they're pretty lenient as long as they understand your plans and you still have ag going on the property. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how to maintain your plot. So you've already got your planting in. It's really starting to come up and look like something, and you're probably feeling pretty pleased, but you might have some difficulties with weeds or brush in the meantime. So at this point, your hands are tied. So that's why preparing the seed bed properly and making sure that you've applied enough herbicide and disked enough to make that a nice seed bed is really important, because at this point you can only spot treat with a high rate of a broad spectrum herbicide like glyphosate. So you really are limited on what you can do. And by spot treat, I'm thinking like either drive around with a hand wand with a four-wheeler or a backpack sprayer or a little pump-up sprayer to spray individual areas. Also, this is not desirable, but if for some reason you missed a pretty big area, you didn't get it glyphosated real well or something, you might have to sacrifice that small area, meaning do some sort of broadcast application of herbicide in order to keep that down so that those invasive species don't move into the rest of your plot. So again, prior preparation really helps out here. If you've got your seed bed in good condition, you're going to thank yourself later because you're going to have less issues with those noxious plants after you plant. So if you only planted native grasses, and again, we don't do that often because typically we're interested somewhat in wildlife who utilize forbs very heavily, but if you only planted native grasses, and you could apply an herbicide with 2,4-D as the active ingredient, and you do need a license in order to apply or purchase a 2,4-D product. But this is active on broadleaf forbs, so you want to make sure your grasses are at least 6 inches tall and have developed true leaves. So there's some disagreement in how many exactly true leaves you need before you spray, but make sure that plant has some height so that the herbicide doesn't ding it at all when it's still young. Let's see. Post-planting considerations. So in addition to what you could do to help maintain anything that comes up, you might consider mowing larger forbs if it's impeding the sunlight from getting to your other seeds. So if all of a sudden you had rains at the right time to really have a flush of one certain forb, you might want to consider shredding that if they're too tall. Consider though that when these weedy looking forbs come up, whether you planted them or if they're volunteer, they can act as nurse plants. They really help hold the soil. They create little microenvironments. They can be very beneficial in helping those other plant species to get established. So don't necessarily count them out just because you see a lot of forbs and not many grasses. Sometimes you might want to consider treating or shredding the forbs if the seeded natives under the weeds are either very small or they're growing a lot more slowly than nearby areas that don't have as many of these larger forbs coming up where you planted. So really consider the whole situation, because a lot of times these annual plants, especially that come up early, they are annual, so they're going to eventually go dormant and die off, and those other plants will have a chance to come up. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if it looks a little bit weedy. Sometimes we're just happy to see something come up to hold the soil for the meantime. Karen asked, is a 4-year burn rotation long enough time after establishment of native seeded areas? So if you didn't get any rain in that time, it was droughty all of those years, and so they really haven't established yet, then I would say no. But in most situations, 4-year rotation should be plenty of time to get decent native seeds to establish. And you have to consider, if you're going to do a prescribed burn, you want that plant to grow and then go dormant at least once, because that's adding fuel for your fire so that you get a better burn when you do finally burn. Good question. So we talked a lot about making sure you got the right species, you take care of the right species ahead of time, you take the right ones out afterwards, but how do you know what's a desirable and undesirable plant? Especially if you're weak at plant identification, that could be a big challenge for you. And some of the species that you're planting you may not even be real familiar with. And so I wanted to just go through a few different options for places you could go or apps you could use to help identify plants. One I would highly recommend is put out through our unit. So I guess I'm a little bit biased, but the Rangeland Plants of Texas database, you could just Google that. It's a really good resource. It has a little help me identify my plant where you can put in characteristics about it. It also has a common name index where you can just look up your plant directly and get information about it. And the reason I like this website, so here's all the characteristics you could select from. And then when you finally get to your plant, like prickly pear here, it not only gives you a description of what the pear looks like, where it can be found, but it also gives you all these different views of the plant. And so I think that's its strength, is that you see the plant growing in the wild, then you see it up close, so you can really narrow down what plants you have. And this Texas Plants of Texas Rangelands database doesn't have every plant in it, but it has most of the more popular plants that we run into. So you could even maybe just narrow it down, so you can call your county extension agent and say, hey, I got a plant, looks like this plant, but it's not because the leaf's shaped different or it has a different colored flower, and that could help them identify what you have too. Another good place to go is USDA NRCS's plant database. I'm a little bit less fond of this site, but only because it's nationwide. So you really have to weed through a lot of different plants and make sure when you do finally find yours that the range map is actually highlighting Texas, because you don't want to be looking at a plant that doesn't even necessarily grow here. But they have the same thing like over here on the left-hand side, where you can look up different characteristics to narrow down the plant. So another good resource is the USDA's plants database. And here's where you would put on all your information about different characteristics, and make sure that you select your state and narrow that down so that you're not looking through too many plants. So here's BRIT Texas Range Plants Guide. This was developed in conjunction with one of our range specialists, Dr. Baron Rector, who's a plant genius, and it has most of the plants, I'd say, that are on the Texas Range database. So if you have a smartphone, this is a good one to get. Right now, BRIT is only available for Android phones, which is funny because I have it on my really old iPhone. I talked to the guy, and they're hoping that next year they have BRIT available for both Android and iPhone again. He said they've had a lot of comments about that, and so they're interested in getting that available for iPhones. It even has a little ID quiz if you're a plant nerd like me. It'll give you a plant picture and then give you 4 different choices you can pick from. So that's kind of a fun thing to do if you're waiting at the doctor's office or something. When you narrow down your plant on here, it'll give you a little picture and description. It's difficult because you can't enlarge the pictures, if you know what I mean. If you click on it, you can't move your fingers to make it bigger. But he also said they've had that request many times, and so they're looking into making those a little bit more easy to zoom into. So that's a good change that could be coming. Leaf Snap, if you haven't used Leaf Snap before, is a really cool app. It's used only for trees, so it's a tree identification app. And what you do is you put a white piece of paper behind the leaf, and I've tried this at a park and it's pretty effective. You take a picture of it with your phone, and it uses the shape of the leaf to narrow down all the trees it could be, and then you can find just which ones grow in your area. So it's really effective and a lot of fun. Kind of makes you look like a genius when you're out there with other people and you tell them what tree it is, even though you've never been there before. So really cool app to download on your phone. And finally, I've had some agents tell me that they like ID weeds. I don't use this app too often just because it's also for nationwide, but some of the agents say that's really good because it has more weeds in it than some of the other apps. But ID Weeds is available and it has the same thing. It'll give you a picture and a little description about each one. So if you want more information about some of the things that I talked about today, there's South Texas Natives website, or of course you could just Google South Texas Natives and it'll come up. Texas A&M's AgriLife bookstore is simply agrilifebookstore.org. That's where you could find our publications on native reseeding in South Texas, which could be very applicable for you too, wherever you are. Also, you'll have the Brush Busters and Weed Busters series on there, so that's something to search for. Web Soil Survey, I would go to Google and just type in Web Soil Survey, but there's the web address if you prefer. And again, Soil Web was the app that you could download that's the same information. And then if you do YouTube, there's 7 reseeding in South Texas videos on YouTube. And I did a little Google search, and if you just do YouTube, comma native reseeding, comma my name, all 7 of them come right up. And there's some on there such as calibrating the native seed drill that we did with South Texas natives, and the guys did a really great job of going through step by step of how to calibrate that drill, because if you lease it, then it's really tough because you're not as familiar with it. Also, pretty much every topic that we covered here today is also in a video. So that might be something to look at or to send to somebody else who you know is interested in doing native reseeding. So again, we have publications available about this topic on AgriLife Bookstore, or you can look on YouTube. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you want to type in down there. Hopefully did I skip anybody, Pete, while I was speaking?
No, you got all the questions that I answered.
Right. I like to try to do them then because later it's like, what were you talking about?
So I guess as they type in the questions and for you to answer, let me kind of say something right here. Is that I'm gonna go ahead and put out the questionnaire. Please fill out the questionnaire, and that really helps us. Responses are anonymous. We don't know who you are, but the information is used to measure impact and improve of future webinars. And here in a little bit, after Dr. Clayton answers some questions, I'm going to talk more about what we're going to do in January. In January, we're going to open up some CEU recorded webinars. So after Dr. Clayton answers some questions, I'll cover that in a little bit more detail.
Now you could go ahead, Pete, because I think they're still typing in questions.
Okay, well, I went ahead and put out the webinar. If by some chance the questionnaire is covering up you can still hear me, but it's covering up your Adobe Connect. If you look down at the bottom of your taskbar, you just see like a little green emblem with 3 gentlemen around like a TV screen. If you just click on that, it'll bring Adobe Connect back to y'all.
Cool. Malcolm asked, is fertilizer indicated or needed after early growth? And in a native reseeding, the main benefit is that you don't have to fertilize. So you're hoping to plant seeds that are self-sufficient. You know, it's like having a kid that's self-sufficient. So you're going to put them out there and hope they do well. Well, that's a bad example because I guess you can't do that with your kid, but I would not suggest putting fertilizer or watering. It could help them grow a little bit faster, but what happens when you fertilize is it might start actually favoring some plants that could use that fertilization over others. And so instead of having a diversity of plants, you might actually accidentally cause more of a monoculture to happen in your planting. And so it's going to kind of reduce the natural competition, and you're going to get a plant community that you may not have desired. So I would suggest not fertilizing it, just to let kind of nature take its course. And although it might be slower than you'd like, Protecting that area is really important and allowing it the time it needs to meet the right weather conditions in order to grow to a size where its longevity is going to be good is really important. I would not necessarily look to fertilize that. Chris asked, how long does it take early successional grasses like springletop to change over to late grasses like little bluestem? So that's a really good question. I really hate to give you the answer. It depends, but it does really depend. It's like depends on your soil type, especially what kind of weather conditions you get. So they're all looking for certain conditions in order to germinate. And so it may just be the year of the something, like we've all seen on our properties. All of a sudden you get a plethora of one certain type of species that year that maybe you haven't even seen for a decade. And it's just because all the stars aligned and the weather conditions and everything was right that year, and that's what germinated. So it's kind of the same with your planting. It's going to highly depend on what weather conditions you get, what type of planting mix you put in there, and what soils you're planting it on. Yeah, but to see late successional species, you would need to wait 2 to 3 years before you really typically start seeing those bigger grasses. But unfortunately, those are the ones that people are usually looking forward to.
As we await more questions, let me say this, that if you signed up for CEUs, please enter your name and email address so we can kind of, makes it a little easier for us to track the folks that are taking CEUs. As we await some questions, should I continue, Megan, and talk
Yeah,
about
go
the...
for it.
Yes, as we await some questions, let me kind of elaborate what's going to happen in January. In January, we have what we call CEU Roundup. And what we have is we're going to open up all those archive webinars, and you can go in and sign up for the different webinars. If you need some CEUs and like in drift management or something like that, some of these courses will have those CEU types, so you can go see what type of CEUs you need and you can take them. We're going to open up of course, we'll have this one open: native reseeding, the brush busters, weed sats and Jupiter, and how to treat. Is our water clean? Mesquite, how to train, and the truth about weeds. So we'll have some drift, and I know the drift is one that folks especially ask about, that you can sign up for. And it'd be the same procedure. You sign up with a registration and go into go into a website, and of course you have to log in with your first name, last name, email, and we'll track you and we'll send you the CEUs. And again, you can also follow us on Facebook.com/Texas Range. Make sure you follow us on Facebook. We also put out a lot of information out on the Facebook information webpage.
All right, thanks for all your help in hosting, Pete, and I appreciate all of you attending today. I'll stay on for another couple minutes in case somebody has extra questions, but otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of the day.
I think I saw a question there come up, one by Chris and
Um,
one by Randy.
Who do we send our name that we are interested in CEUs? So you'll actually go to the our Texas Range webinar website and naturalresources.tamu.edu, and you'll click on the little icon next to the webinar you're interested in registering for, and it'll take you to our TAMU registration site where you'll actually register for the course. To get a CEU, it is $10. You'll pay them and then you'll watch the CEU, and we'll have that you paid, and we'll see that you watched for the appropriate amount of time, and we'll be able to submit your CEU to you after that. But if you have any questions about that, Randy, or if you have trouble with it, feel free to send Pete or I an email and we can help you out with that. Oh yeah, and
Yes,
Pete put that Natural Resource Webinars website down there. See you, ladies.
thank you, Dr. Clayton, and I guess we'll hang around for a little bit. And this is 12:58. See if anybody got more questions.
All right.
Thank you all for attending.
I told you that